The termination letter landed on Derek's desk at 4:47 in the afternoon, and I know the exact time because he called me screaming 12 minutes later, and I was standing in my mother's kitchen watching the clock above the stove tick toward 5. I remember thinking how strange it was that a man who had laughed at my father over a dinner table less than 2 hours earlier could sound so completely undone. His voice cracked on the word fired. It cracked again on why. It didn't crack at all when he said my name, because by then I think some part of him already knew. He just hadn't let himself believe it yet. I had spent 11 months building the thing that would bring him down, and he had spent 11 months handing me every brick. But I should start where it actually started. Not with the phone call, not with the letter, not even with that dinner. I should start with a Tuesday morning in early March, with the smell of my mother's coffee and the particular quality of light in her kitchen, and with my father sitting at the table in his old cardigan, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, working through a crossword puzzle with the focused pleasure of a man who has earned his mornings. That image, that specific, ordinary, irreplaceable image, is where everything begins. And it's where everything eventually comes back. My name is Clara Whitfield. I am 34 years old. I have my father's jaw and my mother's stubbornness, and, as it turned out, a talent for patience that neither of them knew I possessed. My father is Edmund Whitfield. Most people who know him well call him Ed. Most people who know him professionally call him Mr. Whitfield, or Sir, or in certain boardrooms, simply the chairman, though he stepped back from that title 18 months ago and handed operational control to the executive committee, which he had personally assembled over 40 years. He did not disappear. He simply became quieter, more deliberate. He started doing crosswords at the kitchen table on Tuesday mornings, and he let my mother make the coffee, and he read biographies of generals and explorers, and he fed the birds in the garden with a seriousness that suggested he had transferred all his considerable strategic instinct into the problem of keeping the squirrels away from the feeders. He was happy. That's what I want you to understand. He was genuinely, quietly, deeply happy in the way that men sometimes become when they have worked very hard for a very long time and have finally given themselves permission to stop. And he deserved it. He had built Whitfield Capital from a 2-room office above a dry cleaner in 1987 into a private investment firm managing over $4 billion in assets. He had done it honestly, which is rarer than it sounds. He had done it without destroying his marriage or abandoning his children, which is rarer still. He had a reputation in the industry that money cannot buy and time cannot manufacture. The kind of reputation that is simply the accumulated weight of decades of doing the right thing, even when the wrong thing would have been easier and more profitable. And then my sister brought Derek home for Christmas. My sister's name is Sophie. She is 3 years younger than me, and she is beautiful in the effortless, slightly careless way of people who have never had to think much about being beautiful. She is warm and funny and occasionally exhausting, and I love her with the complicated, frayed, utterly unbreakable love of sisters who have grown up too close together to ever fully separate. She has always had a gift for choosing the wrong men with tremendous confidence and then being genuinely shocked when it goes wrong. There was Marcus, who borrowed money and forgot to return it, and also, it turned out, forgot to mention he had a girlfriend in Edinburgh. There was Tom, who was handsome and boring in equal measure, and once argued for 45 minutes that sushi was a form of cultural imperialism. And then there was Derek. Derek Holt was 38 when Sophie brought him to our parents' house for Christmas dinner. He was tall and broad-shouldered and had the kind of face that photographs better than it actually looks in person. A face assembled from individually attractive components that somehow added up to something slightly off, like a sentence where every word is correct, but the meaning still escapes you. He wore expensive clothes with the slight self-consciousness of someone who has recently been able to afford expensive clothes and hasn't yet learned to forget about them. He laughed at his own jokes half a beat before the punchline, which I noticed immediately and filed away without knowing why. He worked in finance, middle management at Hartwell Group, which was a mid-sized asset management firm that occupied 3 floors of a glass building in the city and operated in the comfortable, unremarkable space between genuine ambition and genuine mediocrity. He made a good salary. He drove a car that was slightly too expensive for the salary he admitted to. He spoke with the easy confidence of a man who has been told he is impressive often enough to believe it, and he directed most of that confidence at my father, who received it with the patient, courteous attention of a man who has seen every variety of impressive in his long career and learned to distinguish the real from the performed. My father was polite. He was always polite. But I watched him across the Christmas table, and I saw the thing he did with his eyes when he was listening to someone very carefully, a slight narrowing, a quality of focused stillness. And I thought, he sees it too. Whatever it is, he sees it. Sophie was luminous with happiness. She sat beside Derek and laughed at his stories and touched his arm and looked at him with the full, open, unguarded warmth that she always brings to the things she loves, and I thought, she doesn't see it. And I thought, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm being uncharitable. Maybe this is just a man who is nervous about meeting his girlfriend's family and performing accordingly. Maybe. The weeks after Christmas were quiet. Sophie called me in January, bubbling over with plans. Derek had talked about moving in together, about maybe looking at houses in the spring, about a holiday in Portugal they were planning for summer. She sounded like herself, but amplified, the way she always sounds in the first beautiful months of something new. I listened and asked the right questions and tried to name the small, persistent unease that sat in my chest whenever Derek came up in conversation and couldn't quite manage it. It was like trying to identify a smell you can't place, present and specific, but stubbornly without a name. I saw Derek twice more before the dinner that changed everything. Once at a birthday party for a mutual friend, where he spent most of the evening talking to a group of men he didn't know about deals he was working on, his voice carrying across the room with the comfortable authority of a man who assumes his stories are worth hearing. Once at my parents' house on a Sunday in February, where he helped my father with the bird feeders, or rather stood beside my father while my father worked, offering opinions and occasionally handing him the wrong tool. My father thanked him for each wrong tool with genuine courtesy. Derek didn't notice the courtesy was doing the work that irritation had declined to do. It was at that February visit that I noticed the first thing. It was small and I almost missed it. My mother had made a roast, the Sunday roast she has been making since before I was born, the one that fills the whole house with the smell of rosemary and rendered fat and something warm and foundational that I associate with every safe and comfortable Sunday of my childhood. Derek had second helpings, which was fine, and third helpings of the roast potatoes, which was enthusiastic but acceptable. And then, while my mother was in the kitchen, he had reached across the table and taken the last of the Yorkshire puddings from the serving dish without asking. Not aggressively, not rudely, just with the absent proprietary ease of a man helping himself to something he considers available to him. It was nothing. It was literally nothing. People take food from serving dishes all the time. But my father had been reaching for that Yorkshire pudding. He had been reaching for it with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who has been saving the best thing for last, the way he always does. And Derek's hand had arrived first, and my father had simply redirected his reach to his water glass with a smoothness so practiced it would have been invisible to anyone not watching for it. He didn't say anything. His face didn't change. He picked up his water glass and drank from it and asked Derek a question about the property market, and the moment passed so cleanly it might never have happened. But it happened, and I remembered it. March came in cold and grey and relentless. I was busy with my own work. I run a small consultancy, the kind that does the quiet, unglamorous work of organizational restructuring and strategic review, the kind where you go into companies and tell them things they already know but haven't been willing to say out loud. It suits me. I am good at the quiet, unglamorous work. I am good at sitting still in a room full of noise and finding the signal. I was in the middle of a project for a logistics company in the Midlands, and spending a lot of time on trains and in conference rooms, and Sophie's relationship with Derek was a pleasant, low-priority background concern, the kind of thing you mean to think more about when you have time. I didn't have time until the dinner. The dinner was in April. It was a Saturday. My parents had a tradition, or rather, my mother had a tradition that my father had adopted with the patient grace of a man who understands that traditions are not about the thing itself, but about the people who need them. Of a spring dinner. Not a special occasion exactly. Just the time of year when the garden started to come back and my mother wanted to celebrate it. and she cooked for too many people and set too many places and made the house smell wonderful, and we all arrived and ate and talked and remembered that we were a family. Sophie and I both came. Derek came with Sophie. A few friends of my parents came, people I'd known for decades, comfortable, familiar faces. My mother's friend Roz, who is terrible at cards and wonderful in a crisis, and who once drove me to a hospital at 2 in the morning without asking a single question. Dr. Patel, who had been my parents' physician for 20 years and came to every gathering with a bottle of Burgundy and an unfailing gift for conversation. My father's old business partner Robert, who had retired to the coast but made the trip for occasions he considered worth making. The table was long and the food was good and the wine flowed and the conversation moved in the comfortable wandering way of people who know each other well enough not to perform for each other. My father was at the head of the table, relaxed, attentive, asking questions and actually listening to the answers, which is rarer than it sounds. My mother was everywhere at once, in the way she has always been everywhere at once, the organizing intelligence that makes everything look effortless because it is never seen to be doing any work. Sophie was bright and animated, Derek's hand resting on hers on the table between courses. It was during the main course that it happened. We had been talking about Robert's garden. He had taken up vegetable growing in retirement with the seriousness of a man transferring a lifetime of competitive energy into raised beds. And my father had been asking detailed, genuinely curious questions about soil composition and seasonal planting. And my mother was refilling glasses, and the conversation had that pleasant, meandering quality of a very good evening. And then Derek, for a reason I have never fully understood, chose that moment to perform. He had been quiet for the last 20 minutes, and quietness seemed to sit uncomfortably on him, as if he wore it the way some people wear formal clothes, with a slight tension in the shoulders, a readiness to be done with it. He picked up his wine glass and leaned back slightly in his chair and said, with the particular tonal quality of a man who has decided that the room needs his opinion on something, "Ed, I keep meaning to ask, are you involved at all still with Whitfield Capital, or have you fully stepped back? I ask because there are some restructuring conversations happening over at Hartwell that touch on some of your old portfolio companies, and it'd be useful to know if you still have any influence there, or if that's all moved on." The table went quiet. Not dramatically, it wasn't a jaw-dropping silence. It was the quiet of a room full of people who are very good at reading rooms and have all just registered something at the same moment. Robert set down his fork with a small click. Roz took a sip of her wine. Dr. Patel looked at his plate with the attentive focus of a man finding something very interesting in his lamb. My father looked at Derek with the full, calm, unhurried attention of a man who has been genuinely surprised only a handful of times in his adult life and has learned to treat surprise as information rather than an occasion for reaction. He said pleasantly, "Oh, I have some ongoing interests, yes. The firm still bears the family name after all." He smiled. It was a warm smile. It was an impenetrable smile. And then he asked Robert what varieties of tomato he'd had the best luck with. Derek didn't notice the redirect, or he noticed it and decided to continue anyway, which would have been worse. He said, right, because the word is that Hartwell is going to make a move on Callaway Asset Management, which I think was in your portfolio, and obviously if you're still connected to the board there, it'd be worth understanding the landscape from your end. He said it with the easy, collaborative tone of a man discussing a shared interest, not a man asking an 80% retired investor to compromise his confidential knowledge at a dinner table. My father said, still pleasantly, "Callaway's a good firm. I imagine any conversation around it would benefit from solid legal advice from the outset." And he turned to Dr. Patel and said, "Priya, how is the new practice working out?" And the conversation moved on. Derek had not gotten what he came for. I wasn't sure he fully understood that, but he felt it. I could see it in the slight tightening around his jaw, the way he picked up his fork and put it down again without using it. He reached for the bread basket and took the last piece of bread and ate it in 2 bites, and I watched my father's hand, which had been moving toward the bread basket, redirect to his wine glass instead. Exactly as it had with the Yorkshire pudding. Exactly the same movement, the same seamless pivot, the same absence of any visible reaction. I felt something cold and specific settle in the bottom of my stomach. After dinner, while the plates were being cleared and Robert and Dr. Patel had moved to the sitting room with their burgundy, Derek pushed back his chair and said to the table in general, with the comfortable lordliness of a man who has had enough wine to let his actual voice out, "Well, next time we do this, it should probably be at ours. Sophie and I are going to start looking at places next month, so we'll have a proper home to host in soon enough." He smiled at Sophie, who beamed. He swept his eyes around the table with the satisfaction of a man who has just made an announcement he considers significant. My father said, "How lovely." My mother said, "We'll look forward to it." Their tones were identical, warm, light, completely unreadable. Then my father reached for the last piece of roast parsnip on the serving dish nearest him, and Derek's hand arrived first again. Not aggressively, not even consciously, I think, just the automatic reach of a man who takes what is in front of him, without thinking about whether it might belong to someone else. He speared it with his fork and ate it, and said something to Sophie about the house-hunting apps she'd been using, and my father picked up his wine glass and looked out through the French doors at the dark garden and said nothing at all. I was watching him. His face in profile was completely still. Not unhappy, not angry. Just still, in the way of a man who has noticed something and is deciding what to do with the information. He stayed like that for perhaps 3 seconds. Then he turned back to the table and smiled at something Sophie was saying. 3 seconds, I counted them. We were washing up together, my mother, Sophie, and I, a ritual that had outlasted its practical necessity by decades, preserved now for its own sake. When Sophie said, bright-eyed over the soapy water, "Do you like him? I mean, really?" My mother said, without looking up from the pan she was drying, "He has a great deal of energy." It was such a perfect, complete, devastating non-answer that Sophie and I both laughed, and the moment passed, and I thought, my mother knows too. Whatever it is, she knows it too. I drove home that night through the dark countryside with the radio off and the conversation playing back in pieces in my mind. The question about Whitfield Capital, the bread, the parsnip, the 3 seconds of stillness at the French doors. I thought about Derek's voice when he'd said, "Your old portfolio companies." The slight emphasis on old, the casual assumption of diminishment, the way he'd spoken to my father like a man speaking to someone whose era had passed. I thought about how my father had not reacted to any of it, which was not the same thing as not noticing any of it. I thought, there is something wrong with Derek Holt. I don't know exactly what it is yet, but it is wrong in a specific structural way. Not bad-tempered, not thoughtless, not merely entitled. Something more deliberate than that. Something that has a direction. I filed that thought carefully and went to sleep, and in the morning I went back to my logistics project and didn't think about it for 2 weeks. The call from Sophie came on a Thursday morning, early enough that I was still in my dressing gown with my first coffee. She sounded different, not upset exactly, but compressed, as if she were holding something in carefully. She said she needed to talk to me about something and could I come to London that weekend. I said yes, of course. She said she didn't want to talk about it on the phone. I said fine. She said Derek was away at a conference, it would just be the two of us. She said it the way you say something that is meant to sound incidental, but isn't. I took the train on Saturday morning. Sophie met me at the door of her flat. A good flat in Islington, hers long before Derek was in the picture, with coffee already made and something behind her eyes that I didn't like. We sat at her kitchen table the way we had sat at kitchen tables our whole lives, and she said, "I think something is going on with the firm." She meant Whitfield Capital. She meant our father's firm. She said that Derek had been asking questions. Specifically, he had been asking questions about the firm's current holdings, about which board seats my father still technically held, about the governance structure of the family trust that held the majority stake. He had framed it as curiosity, she said. He had framed it as wanting to understand the family he was becoming part of. He had asked the questions in bed, or over dinner, or in the car on the way somewhere, the way you ask questions when you want them to feel like conversation rather than inquiry. He's been asking about Dad specifically, she said, turning her mug in her hands. About whether he's in good health. About whether the trust documents have been updated recently. About what would happen to the stake if... She stopped. She looked out the window. He phrased it as planning for contingencies. He said all families with assets should think about it. The cold thing in my stomach was back, and this time it had a shape. I said carefully, "How long has he been asking?" She said, "Since February, I think. Maybe January." She said it quietly, the way you say something you've been reluctant to say out loud because saying it makes it real. I said, "Have you told Dad?" She said, "No." She said it quickly, too quickly, and I understood. She didn't want to be the person who had invited this into the family. She didn't want it to be her fault. It wasn't her fault. But I understood why she felt it might be. I stayed the night. We ordered food and watched something on television that neither of us paid attention to and talked around the edges of the thing without going back to its center, the way you sometimes need to talk around something before you can look at it directly. When I left on Sunday morning, she stood in the doorway of her building and said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to find out what he's actually looking for." She said, "Clara." Her voice had a particular quality in it, warning and hope and trust all at once. My name in her mouth the way she's been saying it for 30 years. I said, "I know, I'll be careful." I wasn't careful. I was thorough, which is different and, in the end, more effective. I want to be honest about what I did next, because honesty requires me to say that I did not immediately go to my father. I should have, perhaps. The argument for going directly to him is clear and simple. He built the firm. He is an intelligent man. He deserved to know immediately that someone in his family's orbit was conducting what appeared to be a quiet intelligence-gathering operation on his assets and health. The argument I made to myself for not going to him immediately was this: I didn't have enough. What I had was Sophie's discomfort, a series of questions that could have been innocent, and my own sense of wrongness that had been accumulating since Christmas. None of that was enough. If I went to my father with that, and if I was wrong, if this was all perfectly innocent and I had misjudged Derek entirely, I would have caused Sophie pain and probably ended their relationship and damaged something that might have been real and good. I needed more. So I did what I do professionally. I started looking. Derek Holt's professional history was publicly available in the usual ways: LinkedIn, Companies House, the professional register. He had been at Hartwell Group for 4 years, in a senior analyst role that had been upgraded to associate director 18 months ago. Before Hartwell, he had been at a smaller firm called Penrose Investment Management for 3 years. Before Penrose, there was a 2-year gap that his LinkedIn profile papered over with a vague entry about independent consulting. I noted the gap. I called an old contact at a headhunting firm, a woman named Janet who has been in the city for 30 years and knows more about who is actually doing what than any database could contain. I asked her about Derek Holt in the most casual possible way, slipping his name into a broader conversation about the asset management sector. She paused, and in that pause I heard recognition, and then she said, "The name rings a bell. Let me think." Another pause, then, "Oh, yes. Is he still at Hartwell?" I said yes. She said, well, he was at Penrose before that, wasn't he?" It wasn't quite a question. I said yes. She said, "There were some things at Penrose, nothing that went anywhere. A client raised concerns about how their portfolio information was being used. It was handled internally." She paused again. "Are you asking for any particular reason?" I said it was background research on a potential business contact. She said, "I see." The way she said it, I knew she understood it was something else. "Well, I'd be careful, Clara. That's probably the most useful thing I can say. Nothing that went anywhere. Handled internally." I wrote those phrases down and looked at them for a long time. The 2-year gap before Penrose was harder to trace, and I almost missed it entirely. It emerged eventually through a different source. A former colleague of mine who had worked in compliance at a private equity firm and who owed me a favor from a difficult restructuring project 3 years ago. He came back to me after a few days with a single sentence. There had been an investigation at a firm called Beaumont Capital in 2016, related to the unauthorized sharing of client information with a third party, and a junior analyst had left the firm during the investigation. He couldn't confirm the name. He said the investigation had been closed without formal findings. He said the junior analyst had received, in his words, a very clean reference under the circumstances. A very clean reference under the circumstances. I sat with all of this for 2 days. I sat with it the way I sit with complex problems professionally. Not anxiously, but with a quality of patient, focused attention, turning the information over and looking at it from different angles. What I had was a man with a pattern, not a proven pattern, nothing that had ever resulted in formal findings or legal consequences, but a pattern in the way that water leaves a pattern on stone, not from a single event, but from the accumulated pressure of repeated action over time. A man who got close to people with information or assets. A man who asked careful, plausible questions. A man who operated in the comfortable zone just inside the borders of the permissible, where the most effective predators always live. And this man was sitting at my family's dinner table, eating the last of the parsnips, and asking my father about his board positions, and asking my sister about the family trust in bed. On the third day, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my father's personal solicitor, a man named Graham Fletcher, who had handled the family's legal affairs for 15 years, and who I had met perhaps 20 times at various dinners and events. I called him at his office and said, "Graham, I need to speak with you about something that requires discretion. Can I come in tomorrow?" He said yes. I went in the next morning and sat in his office, all dark wood and the faint smell of old paper and the particular muffled quiet of a room in which important things have been discussed for decades. And I laid out what I had. Carefully, completely. Without speculation, so far as I could manage. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is your father aware of any of this?" I said no. He said, "He needs to be." I said I knew. He said, "The governance documents for the family trust are sound. There's very little that could be done without Edmund's explicit consent and a clear legal process. But if someone is gathering information preparatory to some kind of challenge or claim, it's better to know now than later." He paused. "I should also say, Clara, that if any of this rises to the level of financial fraud or misuse of confidential information, that's a matter for other professionals beyond my expertise. But I know people." I said, "I know you do." He gave me a name. I wrote it down. The second call was to a woman named Frances Obi, who ran a small, extremely discreet investigative firm that specialized in financial due diligence and professional background verification. She had been recommended to me years ago by a client who had used her services before acquiring a business and had described her simply as the person you want when you need to actually know something. I had never used her before. I called her and she answered on the second ring, and I described what I needed, and she said, "Timeline." I said I had no deadline per se, but I would prefer to know sooner rather than later. She said, 2 weeks. I said fine. I did not go to my father yet. I know that will seem like a mistake in retrospect, or perhaps like a calculated coldness. But I want to explain something. My father is not a man who benefits from incomplete information. He is a man who, given incomplete information, will act on it with the same decisive clarity with which he acts on complete information, and the action may or may not be right. I needed to give him the full picture. I needed to be sure. And there was a part of me, smaller and less easily admitted, that needed to be sure for myself, needed to look at the whole of this thing before I could believe it fully, before I could say with certainty that what I had was not a projection of my own early dislike of Derek Holt, but a genuine, documented, verifiable pattern of behavior. I went home and worked on my logistics project and called my mother on the usual Tuesday and did not mention any of it. And I sat with the knowledge the way you sit with a very cold thing, and I waited. The waiting was the hardest part, not because I am impatient. I am not particularly impatient as a rule, but because waiting meant watching something continue that I knew or believed was wrong. It meant seeing Sophie's messages about house viewings and Portugal and the future she was building with a man I was fairly sure was using her as a vehicle. It meant sitting with that knowledge alone in the particular loneliness of knowing something you cannot yet say. I called Sophie twice in those 2 weeks, and each time I was perfectly normal, warm and interested and asking the right questions. And each time I hung up, I sat for a while in the silence of my flat and thought about the gap between what I knew and what I could say. And I felt the specific weight of being the person who holds a thing before anyone else knows it exists. Frances Obi came back in 11 days, which was 3 days earlier than promised. She sent a secure document through a portal she had given me access to, and I opened it on a Thursday evening at my kitchen table with a glass of wine that I didn't drink because I forgot it was there. The document was 22 pages, and it was thorough in the way that only genuinely good professional work is thorough. Not comprehensive for the sake of comprehensiveness, but precise and targeted, and stripped of everything that was not directly relevant. The 2-year gap before Penrose confirmed. Derek Holt had been employed at Beaumont Capital from September 2014 to March 2016, when he had resigned by mutual agreement during an internal investigation into the unauthorized transfer of client portfolio data. The investigation had been closed without formal findings, but a settlement had been reached with the affected client. Details confidential. A colleague who had been interviewed as part of the investigation and had subsequently left the firm of his own volition had, at some later point, apparently given an informal account of the events to someone in his network. Frances Obi had spoken to a person who had spoken to this colleague. The account described a junior analyst who had been feeding detailed client information to a third party, characterized as a consultant who was acquiring positions in stocks that the client was about to move on. The mechanism was simple, old, and very difficult to prove unless you had the bank records or the third party's trading history, which the investigation had not been able to obtain before it ran out of road. The third party had never been publicly identified. The junior analyst had left with a clean reference. Frances Obi had gone further. She had looked at Hartwell Group. She had looked at Derek's client relationships there. She had found one thing that was notable. Derek had, in the past 8 months, established a consulting relationship with a small advisory firm called Meridian Strategic Partners. This relationship was disclosed in Hartwell's compliance register, as it should have been, and it appeared entirely legitimate on its face. Hartwell had no clients in common with Meridian, and the work ostensibly related to general market analysis. But Frances Obi had looked at Meridian Strategic Partners more carefully than the compliance register required. She had found that Meridian had been incorporated 14 months ago. She had found that its sole listed director was a man named Philip Crane. She had found that Philip Crane had been a partner at Beaumont Capital from 2013 to 2016. Philip Crane. Beaumont Capital. 2013 to 2016. I read that 3 times. Then I put down the document and looked at my untouched glass of wine and felt the cold thing in my stomach crystallize into something hard and clear and specific, like water becoming ice, a state change, irreversible, with a new set of properties. This was not opportunistic. This was not a man of casual bad habits who happened to be dating my sister and happened to ask too many questions. This was a man with a working methodology, a consistent partner and a target. And the target was my father's firm. I called Graham Fletcher at 7 in the morning and told him I had the full picture and needed to meet. He said, "Come in at 9. I said, "Thank you." I hung up and sat in the early light of my kitchen and felt the specific clarity that comes on the other side of uncertainty. Not comfortable, not peaceful, but clear. Sharp as winter air. I knew what I was dealing with. I knew what had to happen. And I knew, with the precision of someone who has spent 2 weeks waiting and thinking and preparing, exactly how I was going to do it. But there was one thing I had to do before any of it. I had to go to my father. I drove out on a Friday morning. He was at the kitchen table when I arrived, crossword in front of him, cardigan, reading glasses pushed up, coffee in the mug my sister had given him for his birthday that said "Best Chairman" in faded letters that he found privately amusing. The radio was on low, a classical music program, something unhurried and warm. The kitchen smelled of coffee and toast and the particular domestic peace of a house inhabited by 2 people who love each other and have run out of the need to prove it. My mother came in from the garden with her hands muddy and took one look at my face and said, "Edmund," in a particular tone that caused my father to look up from his crossword and over the top of his glasses at me, with the full, still attention I have been subject to since childhood, the attention that says, "I am here, I am listening, tell me everything." I told him everything. My mother washed her hands at the sink and sat down beside him, and I spread the facts out in front of them the way you spread a map, clearly, completely, without editorializing, because facts presented honestly need no editorial assistance. I told him about Sophie's call and what she'd said. I told him about my research, about Janet and the Gap and Penrose and Beaumont. I told him about Francis Obi's report and Philip Crane and Meridian's strategic partners and what it added up to. I put the document on the table in front of him and he read it, slowly, the way he reads everything, with the same focused attention he gives to crosswords and biographies of generals. My mother read it over his shoulder. The radio played something quiet and unhurried in the background. When he finished, he set the document on the table and took off his reading glasses and folded them carefully and set them on top of the document. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been working on this?" I said, 3 weeks. He said, "Alone?" I said, "Largely. Graham Fletcher knows, and Francis Obi." He nodded. He looked at my mother and she looked at him, and the look between them was the kind of look that contains a whole conversation. Not words, but understanding. The compression of 40 years of shared life into a single exchange of glances. Then he looked back at me and said, "What do you think he was after, specifically?" I said I had a theory. The family trust held a controlling stake in Whitfield Capital. A hostile challenge to the trust, based, for instance, on a contested assessment of the settlers' capacity, or on alleged procedural irregularities in the trust's governance, could, if successful, trigger a period of legal uncertainty during which the firm's board positions and operational decisions would be vulnerable to external influence. It would not give Derek direct control, but it might give Philip Crane, or whoever was behind Crane, a window. And in a window, if you know what you're doing, a great deal can happen. It was sophisticated, patience-intensive, the kind of scheme that requires a long runway and a reliable intelligence source inside the target family. It required someone like Derek, charming, plausible, already inside. My father listened to all of this without expression. When I finished, he was quiet again for a few seconds. Then he said very quietly, "He took the last of the parsnips." I looked at him. He was looking at the document on the table. "Both times," he said, "the Yorkshire pudding and the parsnips." He paused. A man who helps himself to things from other people's plates does it because he believes, on some level, that what is on the table is available to him, that it belongs to whoever reaches for it first. He picked up his glasses and put them back on. I noticed. I wanted to see if he'd do it again. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a bird was doing something industrious near the feeder. My mother said, to no one in particular, "I knew it was the parsnips." That afternoon, the three of us went to Graham Fletcher's office. My father read the full report a second time, this time with Graham present, and Graham walked through the legal implications with the careful thoroughness that I had come to expect from him, and my father asked questions that were so precise and specific that Graham kept pausing mid-sentence to adjust his explanation upward, like a man recalibrating the level of his presentation on the fly. My father had not been away from the industry long enough to lose the fluency. He had simply been waiting in his kitchen, reading crosswords and feeding birds, with everything he had ever known intact and undiminished. There was a conversation about what to do. It was not a long conversation, because the options were relatively clear, and my father has never been a man who needs a long runway to reach a decision once the relevant facts are in front of him. There were 2 tracks. The professional track, which concerned Derek Holt's employment at Hartwell Group and the consulting arrangement with Meridian strategic partners, and the personal track, which concerned my sister. Of the 2, the personal track was immeasurably the more delicate. Graham said the right person to speak to about Hartwell was a solicitor and former regulator named Catherine Park, who was the person he had mentioned at our first meeting. He said she was not cheap and not comfortable, but that if you had a legitimate concern about a firm's compliance register and a potential misuse of client information, she was the person who would know exactly what needed to be said and to whom. My father said, "Get her on the phone." Graham got her on the phone that afternoon. I sat in the corner of his office and listened to my father speak to Catherine Park for 45 minutes with a clarity and precision that made me feel, for the first time in years, the full weight of what he had built and who he had always been. And I felt something complicated and profound that I have not been able to name cleanly since. Not pride exactly, because pride is something you feel from outside, and this was more interior than that. It was recognition. He was my father, and I recognized him. Catherine Park said she would need to see the documentation. We sent it. She came back 2 days later with a set of questions that needed answers and a very clear articulation of what a referral to the FCA's supervision division might look like and what would need to be established to support it. She said there were also, in her view, grounds for a conversation with Hartwell Group's compliance director that, if handled correctly, would make Hartwell's position very clear to them without the need for a formal referral in the first instance. She said Hartwell would want to handle this quietly. She said, in the dry, precise tone of a woman who has watched institutions protect themselves for a very long time. In my experience, the offer of a quiet resolution is often the most effective instrument available. My father said, "Make the call." I want to say something about that week because it deserves to be said accurately. It was one of the strangest weeks of my life. Strange in the sense of layered, of existing on multiple levels at once. On one level, there were lawyers and documents and strategic conversations about regulatory referrals and the careful choreography of a quiet institutional process. On another level, entirely parallel, Sophie was sending me photographs of houses she and Derek had viewed. A Victorian terrace in Twickenham, a converted warehouse in Bermondsey, and texting me about colours for the living room and asking if I thought she should get a dog. The two realities coexisted with a surrealism that I managed by keeping them very strictly separate in my mind. The way you keep two chemicals apart that you know, if combined, will do something irreversible. I had not yet told Sophie. I had not yet told Sophie because I did not know what telling Sophie looked like until I knew how everything else was going to resolve. And because telling Sophie prematurely meant asking her to sit with knowledge she couldn't act on in a relationship she was still in. And that seemed a particular cruelty that I wasn't willing to inflict before I had to. This was a judgment call I made alone, at night, in the quiet of my flat, several times in that week, weighing it from different angles and arriving at the same conclusion each time. She needed to know. She would know. But not yet. Not yet. Catherine Park made the call to Hartwell on a Wednesday. She made it to Hartwell's general counsel, whose name was a man called Andrew Briggs, and the call lasted approximately 35 minutes, and I know this because Graham Fletcher was on the call and reported back to me afterward. The conversation, as Graham described it, was civil and efficient in the way that conversations are civil and efficient, when everyone in the room understands that the alternative to civility and efficiency is very expensive and very public. Andrew Briggs had listened carefully to the summary of concerns, which Catherine Park had presented with the precision and authority of someone who knows exactly how much to say and exactly how to say it. He had asked clarifying questions. He had thanked her for bringing the matter to Hartwell directly. He had said he would need to speak to certain people internally before any response could be given. Catherine Park had said she understood and had given him a timeline. The timeline was 72 hours. I don't know exactly what happened inside Hartwell Group in those 72 hours. I know some of what happened, from Graham, and some more from a source I'll come to later, and the rest I have assembled from the chain of events that followed, the way you reconstruct a path from footprints. What I know is that Andrew Briggs spoke to the CEO. What I know is that the CEO reviewed Derek Holt's compliance file. What I know is that the compliance file, when reviewed with appropriate attention, revealed several things that the compliance register had technically disclosed, but that a more pointed reading now made newly significant. What I know is that Hartwell Group had been, for some time, very happy with a mid-level associate director who brought in 1 or 2 decent clients per year and had good relationships with a few useful contacts and caused no visible trouble. What I know is that Hartwell Group became, very rapidly, very significantly less happy with that same mid-level associate director once the lens through which he was being viewed had been adjusted. The termination letter was signed on a Friday. The timing was not accidental. The specific language of the termination, which cited a breach of the firm's outside business activities policy in relation to the undisclosed nature of the Meridian Strategic Partners arrangement, a conclusion that Hartwell had reached through its own internal review process after its general counsel had been made aware of certain concerns, was drafted carefully enough to be legally defensible and vague enough to close the door on immediate recourse. The severance package was adequate. The non-disclosure clause was standard. The reference would describe him as competent and professional and omit everything else. In the tradition of clean references under the circumstances, that appeared to follow Derek Holt from firm to firm, like a weather system. He got the letter at 4:47 on a Friday afternoon, delivered by email with a follow-up call from HR. He called me at 4:59, 12 minutes. I was standing in my mother's kitchen. I had driven out that morning, not for any particular reason that I had named to myself, but I think some part of me knew that Friday was the day and that I wanted to be in the house where this had all started. At the table where the parsnips had been taken, where my father had redirected his hand to his water glass, where 3 seconds of stillness at the French doors had been the beginning of something Derek Holt had not seen coming, and still, I think, did not fully understand. I was standing at the counter making tea when my phone rang, and Derek's name was on the screen, and I looked at it for one full ring cycle before I answered. His voice, when he spoke, was the voice of a man who is very frightened and trying very hard not to sound very frightened, which is one of the most distinctive vocal qualities in existence. He said he'd been terminated. He said there had been some kind of complaint, some kind of external interference, something had been referred to compliance, and he didn't know where it had come from, but it wasn't legitimate. It was some kind of misunderstanding, or his voice did something complicated here, a kind of tightening, or something worse than a misunderstanding. He said he needed to know if I knew anything about it. He said it in the careful, neutral tone of a man asking a question he already suspects the answer to. I said, "I'm sorry to hear that, Derek." He said, "Clara." Just my name, the way Sophie says my name, but entirely different, not warm, not trusting, but pointed. A key trying a lock. "Did you know about this?" I said, "I think there were concerns raised about some aspects of your professional conduct. I understand those concerns were taken seriously by Hartwell's leadership." There was a pause. It was a very specific pause. The pause of a man processing the confirmation of a thing he had feared, but hoped was untrue. His voice, when it came back, had changed. The frightened but holding it together quality was gone, and in its place was something flatter and colder and less controlled. He said, "Was it your father?" I said, "Hartwell made their own decision based on their own review." He said, "That is not what I asked." I said, "I think the question of who raised concerns is probably less important than the question of why those concerns were legitimate." Another pause. Longer this time. He said, "You have no idea what you've done." I said very quietly, very evenly, "I think I have a fairly good idea of what I've done, Derek. I also think I have a very good idea of what you were planning to do." I paused for one beat. "The documents are comprehensive. Graham Fletcher has copies. Catherine Park has copies. The FCA Supervision Division has been notified as a precautionary measure." I wasn't going to tell him that last part, but something in the way he said, "You have no idea," made me decide to, and I don't regret it. "I'd recommend speaking to a solicitor before you do anything else." He said, "Sophie will," and stopped. I said, "Sophie will make her own decisions when she has all the information. That's generally what people do." He said nothing for several seconds. Then he said, "Your father, the great Edmund Whitfield, retired to his garden." The bitterness in his voice was extraordinary. Not the bitterness of surprise, but the bitterness of a man who has spent a long time constructing a story in which he was the clever one and is now having to revise it. He's a relic. The firm should have been restructured years ago. It would have been worth 10 times what it is now if... I said, "Derek." My voice was level. "He can hear you." A silence. My father was sitting at the kitchen table behind me. He had come in from the garden 5 minutes earlier and sat down with his crossword and said nothing, because he had seen the name on my phone screen and known what it meant. And he was a man who understood that some conversations need to be witnessed and not interrupted. He was looking at his crossword puzzle with a quality of calm attention that I will carry in my memory for the rest of my life, because it was the most complete expression of a certain kind of strength I have ever seen. Not aggressive strength, not the strength of someone who needs to win, but the strength of a man who has outlasted the attempt on something he built and is sitting quietly at his kitchen table in his cardigan, and it is enough, and he knows it is enough. Derek said nothing. I said, "Goodbye, Derek." I hung up. My father wrote something in his crossword. He turned the page. The kitchen was quiet except for the radio. My mother came in from the hall with the good bottle of Burgundy that Dr. Patel had brought to the spring dinner and had apparently been set aside for a specific occasion, because she set 3 glasses on the counter with the deliberate satisfaction of a woman who has been waiting to open this bottle and has now identified the right moment. She poured. She handed me a glass. She handed my father a glass. She picked up her own and said, without any particular ceremony, "Well?" My father picked up his glass and said, "Well." He looked at me over the rim, and in his eyes behind the reading glasses was something warm and specific. Not pride, which would have felt like evaluation, but something more like recognition. He said, "You got the paperwork right." It was the highest compliment he had ever paid me professionally, and we both knew it, and neither of us needed to say so. We drank the wine. The conversation with Sophie was the hardest thing I have ever done. Not because she was angry, she wasn't angry, at least not at me, but because of the particular expression on her face when I told her the details, when I laid out what Derek had been doing and why, and her expression was not shock. It was recognition. The slow, awful recognition of someone seeing a shape they had already sensed but had chosen not to look at directly, seeing it now in full light and understanding that the choice not to look had been a form of hope, and that hope is now gone. She cried. I held her. We sat in her kitchen for a long time, and I told her everything, and she asked very few questions, which is what people do when they already know enough of the answers. She said, at one point, "Did Dad know? Before you came to him?" I said, "I think he knew something was wrong. He just didn't know the specifics." She said, "The parsnips." I said, "Yes." She almost laughed. It was the particular laugh that is also grief that Sophie has always been better at than me. The ability to feel 2 things at once without having to choose between them. She said, "I'm so angry at myself." I said, "Don't be." I meant it. You brought a man home to your family. You loved someone. You shared your life with someone. Those are normal human things. What he did with that is his, not yours. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need to call him." I said, "You don't have to do it today." She said, "I know." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I want to." I waited in her sitting room while she made the call in the kitchen. I don't know what was said. She was in there for 11 minutes, and when she came out, her face was very still, and she said, "He said I should thank my family for destroying his career." She said it without particular emotion, as if reporting a thing she had already processed on the way from the kitchen. Then she said, "He also said that he genuinely cared about me. I think he might have believed that." I said, "That's probably the most complicated part." She nodded. She sat beside me on the sofa and put her head on my shoulder, the way she has done since we were children. I put my arm around her. Outside, the city was doing its city things. Sirens somewhere, the low hum of traffic, a fragment of music from a window. I felt her breathe. I breathed with her. We didn't say anything for a while, and it was enough. In the months that followed, the professional consequences for Derek Holt accumulated with the quiet, thorough inevitability of things that have been set properly in motion. The FCA Supervision Division, which Catherine Park had notified as a precautionary measure, opened a preliminary inquiry into the Meridian Strategic Partners arrangement and its relation to the historic concerns at Beaumont Capital. Preliminary inquiries do not always become investigations. Investigations do not always become enforcement actions. But the opening of a preliminary inquiry has a way of following a person. It sits in a certain file, in a certain database, in the institutional memory of a certain regulator, and it does not easily go away. Derek's ability to work in regulated financial services was not immediately ended, but its future was, for the first time in his career, genuinely uncertain. Philip Crane, whose name had appeared in Francis Obi's report as the director of Meridian Strategic Partners, apparently departed to pursue interests in a jurisdiction with a warmer climate and a less attentive regulatory environment. The timing of his departure was notable. Meridian Strategic Partners was dissolved 6 weeks after Derek's termination. The dissolution was handled cleanly, which was, in its way, the most Philip Crane contribution to the situation. Hartwell Group's compliance director gave an interview to an industry publication 3 months later about the importance of robust outside business activities policies. The irony was presumably unintentional. Sophie did not find another flat immediately. She stayed in hers and spent the summer doing things she had been intending to do for years. She learned to throw pottery with great enthusiasm and variable results, and she started running in the mornings, and she visited a friend in Japan in August and came back with a quality of quietness and aliveness at the same time that I had not seen in her for years. She dated no one. She seemed in some way I found difficult to articulate but easy to perceive. Lighter. As if the absence of a certain weight she had been carrying, without knowing it, had given her back a part of herself she'd forgotten she'd lost. We talked more than we had in years. Not about Derek, less and less about Derek as the months passed, and eventually almost not at all, but about other things. The things you talk about when you have been reminded of what matters. Our parents, the future, what we wanted it to look like. She called me one evening in October and said she'd been thinking about starting her own business. She worked in design, and she'd been doing it for other people's firms for years, and maybe it was time to do it for herself. I said I thought that was exactly right. She said, "You'd help me with the business planning?" I said, "Of course." She said, "Don't tell Mum yet, I'm still thinking." I said I wouldn't. She said, "Clara." Just my name, the old way. "Thank you." I said, "You would have done it for me." She said, "I know." A pause. "But you did it better." I drove out to my parents' house on a Sunday in November, a grey, still Sunday, the kind that feels like the world holding its breath before winter. The garden was stripped back and a little bare but tended, the feeders full and busy, a pair of wood pigeons doing something disagreeable to the lawn. My father was at the kitchen table with his crossword and his coffee and his cardigan, and the radio was on, the same classical program, or one very like it. And my mother was making something that smelled of apples and cinnamon and the specific warmth of late autumn. I sat down across from my father. He looked up over his glasses. He said, "How are you?" I said, "Good." I was. "How are you?" He said, "Fine. Excellent, in fact." He pushed the crossword toward me and pointed to a clue in the bottom corner. 9 letters. One who acts on another's behalf in matters requiring expertise and discretion. He looked at me. I've been stuck on it all morning. I looked at the clue. I looked at the grid. I looked at the letters he'd already filled in around it. There were only 3, but they were enough. I picked up the pen he had set down beside the crossword and filled in the answer. A DVOCATE. He looked at the word for a moment, then he looked at me. He said very quietly, "Yes, that's right." He picked up his coffee. "That's exactly right." My mother set a plate of warm apple cake on the table between us and said nothing, because she is a woman who understands that the best moments do not benefit from commentary. I took a piece. My father took a piece. The birds argued over the feeders in the garden. The radio played something unhurried and warm. The kitchen smelled of coffee and cinnamon and old wood and the particular deep domestic peace of a house that has been loved in for a very long time. I ate the apple cake. Outside, the November sky was the color of old pewter and absolutely still. Inside, everything was exactly as it should be. The crossword sat on the table between us with its one new answered clue, and I thought about the dinner table in April, and the parsnips, and the 3 seconds at the French doors, and a man in a glass building somewhere in the city who had reached for something that was not his to take and found, instead of what he expected, the edge of a thing that had been waiting quietly to meet him. I thought about my father's hand redirecting to his water glass. Twice, without reaction, without a word, patient, deliberate, complete. I poured myself more coffee. The birds outside were very busy. The morning settled around us like something comfortable and permanent, and I thought, this is what it looks like when someone has built something that holds. Not the glass and the architecture and the 4 billion under management. Not the reputation and the industry standing and the name on the building. The kitchen, the crossword, the apple cake, the daughter across the table who knows now what she is capable of. The thing that was here before and will be here after because it was built on something real. Advocate, 9 letters. My father smiled at his crossword and said nothing, and neither did I, and it was the most complete silence I have ever sat inside, full of everything that had happened and everything we had not needed to say and everything that remained unchanged and undiminished, on the other side of all of it. I put down my coffee cup. The birds at the feeder suddenly took off all at once in a single startled rush of wings, dark shapes against the grey sky, briefly scattered and then gone. The garden was still again. The feeder swung gently in the cold air. I thought about the word I had written in the crossword. I thought about what it meant to act on someone's behalf in matters requiring expertise and discretion, and I thought about 11 months and 2 weeks and a folder of documents and a phone call at 4:59 on a Friday afternoon, and I thought about Sophie's voice saying thank you in October, and I thought about my father's voice saying that's exactly right over a cup of coffee on a Sunday in November. I thought, yes, that's what this was, and I would do it again. Without hesitation, without apology, and without leaving a single parsnip on the serving dish.